China built something it wasn't supposed to. Not a weapon, not a base, a system. A hidden network designed to keep its economy running no matter the rules, no matter the restrictions. And for years, it worked. Quietly, efficiently, profitably. It looked like the smartest move on the board. But systems built outside the rules come with a cost. And right now, that cost is coming due. Because the very thing that gave China an edge is now turning into a trap it can't escape. Let's break it down. To understand how China ended up here, you need to understand one thing first. China runs on oil it doesn't have. The country burns through roughly 16 million barrels of oil every day. That's more than any nation on Earth except the United States. It fuels the factories, shipping ports, trucking routes, the power plants, basically the entire engine of the world's second largest economy. But here's the problem. China doesn't produce anywhere near enough oil to feed that machine. In 2025, the country imported a record 11.6 million barrels per day, covering more than 70% of its total consumption. And more than half of these imports came from one region, the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, the UAE, Kuwait. Most of it slipped through a single narrow waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, China built the most powerful industrial economy in modern history on a fuel supply that it doesn't control, shipped through a choke point it can't defend. Every factory, every export container, every truck moving goods across the country, all of it depends on that oil arriving on time and on budget. And when it does, things hum. When it doesn't, prices spike, margins collapse, and supply chains buckle. And here's the thing that most people don't realize. Oil isn't just about cars and gas stations. In China, up to half of all oil consumed goes to heavy industry and transportation. Diesel is the lifeblood of Chinese manufacturing. Naphtha feeds the plastics plants. Fuel oil runs the ships that carry Chinese exports to the rest of the world. Cheap oil doesn't just help China compete, it's the competitive advantage. So when that oil supply is stable and affordable, China can underprice competitors, flood global markets with cheap goods, and keep the whole machine turning. But when it isn't, well, that's when the cracks show. So China needed a solution, and it found one, just not the kind that you'd expect. Starting in the late 2010s, two oil-rich nations found themselves locked out of the global market: Iran and Venezuela, both sitting on enormous reserves, both producing heavy, high-sulfur crude that was harder to refine and less attractive to Western buyers, and both slapped with crushing U.S. sanctions that cut them off from international banks, shipping insurance, and legitimate trade routes. Their oil became practically untouchable, which made it also incredibly cheap. Iranian and Venezuelan crude traded at $20 to $30 per barrel below the global benchmark, a massive discount. And for a country burning through 16 million barrels a day, that kind of saving adds up fast. China saw an opportunity, and it took it. By the mid-2020s, roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports were ending up in China, but not through official channels. On paper, Beijing reported almost zero imports from Iran after 2022. But third-party tracking data told a completely different story. Tanker watchers estimated that China was absorbing around 1.4 million barrels per day of Iranian oil alone. Venezuela added another 350,000 to 400,000 barrels on top of that. But if the sanctions block normal shipping and banking channels, how was any of this getting through? China didn't just buy the oil. It built the entire infrastructure to make the relationship permanent. In 2021, Beijing and Tehran signed a 25-year strategic partnership, a deal worth hundreds of billions of dollars covering investments in Iranian oil, gas, ports, and transportation corridors. New pipeline and rail links were planned to connect Iranian ports directly to Western China, bypassing the dangerous sea lanes entirely. China even supplied Iran with advanced air defense systems, electronic warfare equipment, and its Beidou satellite navigation system to replace GPS. Beijing wasn't just buying Iranian crude, it was investing in Iran's survival. And Iran needed that lifeline. With Western markets closed off, China's purchases provided Tehran with tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue, money that kept the regime afloat. That's where things get creative and a lot more dangerous. What China built wasn't just a trade arrangement, it was an entire shadow economy for oil. At the center of it sat what analysts call the shadow fleet. Hundreds of aging tankers flying flags of convenience with their tracking transponders switched off, operated by shell companies with no public paper trail. These ships would load Iranian crude at Karg Island in the Persian Gulf and then sail to waters near Malaysia or Indonesia, for a mid-ocean handoff. The oil would be transferred from one tanker to another, a process called ship-to-ship transfer, and the receiving vessel would sail into Chinese ports with paperwork claiming the cargo was Malaysian or Indonesian in origin. Venezuelan crude followed the same playbook. Heavy Marey-grade oil was loaded in the Caribbean, relabeled as Brazilian blend stock, and funneled through intermediaries before arriving in China under completely falsified documentation. And the numbers gave the game away, if you knew where to look. Malaysia produces only about 560,000 barrels of oil per day. But by 2024, China's official customs data showed that it was importing over 1.4 million barrels per day from Malaysia. That's more than double what the country actually produces. The explanation? Most of those barrels were Iranian crude, relabeled after ship-to-ship transfers in Malaysian waters. It was an open secret hiding in plain sight. And who was buying all of this rebranded oil? Not China's state-owned giants. The real action happened at a network of small, privately owned refineries concentrated in Shandong province, the so-called teapot refineries. Roughly 24 of these plants now account for nearly a quarter of China's refining capacity. They were perfectly positioned, small enough to avoid international scrutiny, flexible enough to process the heavy, sour grades that Iran and Venezuela were selling, and hungry enough to take the risk. Once inside these refineries, the oil's origin was effectively erased. It got blended, refined, and turned into diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, petrochemical feedstock, whatever they needed. Then sold domestically or exported abroad as legitimate Chinese products. By 2025, China was exporting nearly $40 billion worth of refined petroleum products. A significant chunk of that came from crude that was never supposed to reach a Chinese port in the first place. By 2025, sanctioned oil from Iran, Russia, and Venezuela made up as much as 40% of China's total imports. This wasn't a side hustle. This is an industrial-scale operation, and it was saving China billions of dollars a year. Hey, if you're watching this and thinking, how did nobody stop this? Subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what happens next is where the whole thing starts to unravel. Here's where the story shifts, because the problem with a system this effective is that you start to depend on it. And once you depend on it, you can't walk away. China's teapot refineries didn't just buy sanctioned crude when it was convenient. They retooled their entire operations around it. Their plants were specifically configured to handle the heavy, high-sulfur grades coming from Iran and Venezuela. Switching to lighter, more expensive crude from Saudi Arabia or the open market would mean higher costs, lower margins, and, in some cases, physical incompatibility with their equipment. And it isn't just the refineries. China's entire export model for petroleum products depended on the cost gap between what it paid for sanctioned crude and what it sold refined products for on the global market. That gap was the profit engine. You remove it, and the math doesn't work anymore. Meanwhile, China was quietly reshuffling its supplier portfolio. Saudi exports to China dropped by roughly 10% between 2021 and 2024, as Beijing leaned harder into cheaper Russian, Iranian, and Venezuelan barrels. The strategy was clear. You take what you can get at a discount and let the premium suppliers compete for what's left. China also stockpiled aggressively. By late 2025, its strategic and commercial oil reserves had swelled to roughly 1.3 billion barrels, one of the largest stockpiles in all the world. Enough to cover around 200 days of imports. From March 2025 onward, China was adding nearly 1 million barrels a day to storage, a pace one industry executive called very impressive. 11 new storage facilities were under construction across the country, with a combined capacity of 169 million barrels. Beijing was clearly preparing for something. But reserves are just a cushion, not a solution. They can buy time, but they don't fix the underlying vulnerability. And if a crisis drags on for months, which is exactly what's happening now, even a billion-barrel stockpile starts to look thin. This wasn't a backup plan anymore. It had become the plan. And that's where the cracks start to appear. Because when the U.S. decided to squeeze China's supply lines, they knew exactly where to press. Let's start in March of 2025. Washington went after the teapots directly. The Treasury Department sanctioned Shandong Shaoguang Luking Petrochemical, the first time the U.S. had ever targeted a Chinese refinery over Iranian oil. A second round followed in April, hitting Shandong Shengxing Chemical. A third round in May caught Hebei Xinghai Chemical Group, a bigger player with full crude import quotas. The message landed. 5 additional refineries in Shandong halted Iranian purchases almost immediately, afraid that they would be next on the list. Port operators in the province started banning sanctioned tankers from docking. The entire shadow supply chain began tightening. But Washington wasn't just targeting refineries, it was going after the infrastructure. In late January of 2026, Panama's Supreme Court annulled the concession that had allowed a subsidiary of Hong Kong-based CK Hutchison to operate port terminals at both ends of the Panama Canal, Balboa on the Pacific side and Cristobal on the Atlantic. By late February, Panamanian authorities physically seized the ports, threatened CK Hutchison employees with criminal prosecution if they refused to leave, and handed interim operations to Maersk and MSC. Beijing warned that Panama would, quote, pay a heavy price, but the takeover stood. The canal handles roughly 5% of global trade and 40% of U.S. container traffic. For China, losing operational influence over those terminals meant losing a critical node in its Atlantic oil and cargo routing, and a symbolic defeat in the broader contest over who controls the world's trade arteries. At the same time, U.S. Naval Patrol stepped up interdiction of shadow tankers in the Caribbean and Gulf of America. Washington seized a Panama-flagged vessel called the Centuries carrying Venezuelan crude. Venezuelan oil flows to China dropped sharply, projected to fall as much as 74% by early 2026. The network that once looked untouchable was now under siege from every direction. But all of that was just the warm-up, because what happened on February 28th of 2026 changed everything. On that date, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a massive air and maritime campaign targeting Iranian command centers, IRGC headquarters, ballistic missile sites, naval assets, and military airfields. Among the casualties, Iran's supreme leader. The head of U.S. Central Command reported that at least 17 Iranian ships were destroyed within days. Not a single Iranian vessel was left operating in the Arabian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, or even the Gulf of Oman. Iran's response was immediate and ferocious. The Revolutionary Guard declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Drone and missile attacks hammered ships attempting to transit. Retaliatory strikes hit targets in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and even damaged parts of Qatar's massive LNG export facility. Damage that Qatar warned could take up to 5 years to repair. Within days, tanker traffic through the strait collapsed by more than 90%, effectively dropping to zero for commercial vessels. At least 21 confirmed attacks on ships were recorded within weeks, and the oil market reacted with fury. Brent crude, which had been trading around $73 per barrel before the strikes, surged past $100 within 10 days. It peaked at $126, the highest level in 4 years. By the end of March, Brent had gained roughly 55% for the month, the biggest monthly surge since the contract's inception in 1988. For China, this was a nightmare scenario. Up to 55% of its oil imports normally transit the Strait of Hormuz. That includes nearly everything from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar, plus any Iranian barrels that were still flowing. With the strait effectively shut, every tanker bound for China would face delays, reroute around Africa, which skyrocketed insurance premiums or the risk of being attacked. On March 26th, Iran announced that it would allow ships from China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan to transit the strait. But even this selective access hasn't restored anything close to normal flow. As of late March, maritime traffic through Hormuz remains severely constrained, and the ripple effects are spreading fast across Asia. Pakistan has asked citizens to watch cricket matches from home to conserve fuel. Thailand is reporting shortages. Hundreds of gas stations in Australia have run dry. Airlines have canceled flights from Vietnam to New Zealand. South Korea imposed a 5-month ban on naphtha exports to protect its own petrochemical industry. And China, the world's biggest crude importer, has started curbing its own fuel exports just to keep domestic supply stable. The crisis is far from over. So what does this actually mean for China's economy? The answer is worse than most people realize. Let's start with the refineries. The cheap Iranian and Venezuelan crude that fueled their margins is either gone or arriving under enormous risk premiums. A Chinese refiner that was paying $50 per barrel for Iranian crude may now be looking at $80 or $90 for Gulf alternatives, if they can get them at all. Profit margins that were already thinning are now collapsing. Beijing saw this coming and tried to soften the blow. In December of 2024, the government quietly cut the export tax rebate on refined petroleum products from 13% to 9%, effectively a $3 per barrel tax increase on fuel exports. It was a signal. China was preparing to keep more fuel at home instead of exporting it, because it knew the cheap inputs were disappearing. But the damage runs deeper than refineries. China is the world's largest producer of plastics and synthetic fibers. It built 7 enormous petrochemical complexes in the last decade, surpassing the United States in ethylene and polyethylene output. All of that was built on one assumption: cheap feedstock. When oil prices surge, those plants face massive cost inflation. Some may curtail output, others may delay expansion. And in a global market already worried about oversupply of Chinese petrochemicals, rising input costs could tip the entire sector from boom to bust. And then there's the consumer side. Diesel drives China's trucks and factories. Rising diesel costs mean higher prices for food, goods, and transportation, hitting ordinary people the hardest. Reports of fuel shortages and gas station queues have already surfaced in Chinese cities. Several Asian nations, including China, have begun curbing fuel exports to preserve domestic supply. Even China's state media acknowledged the situation, with Xinhua calling the shortages a man-made crisis in early 2026. That kind of language from an outlet that never criticizes the government, that tells you how serious this has gotten. Meanwhile, China's geopolitical leverage is shrinking. For years, Beijing played both sides, buying cheap from sanctioned regimes while courting Gulf producers for stability. That balancing act is over. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, sensing China's desperation, are gaining negotiating power. Any move by Beijing to double down on Iran risks alienating the Gulf partners it needs more than ever. And there's a bitter irony here. For over a decade, China wielded its near monopoly on rare earth minerals as a geopolitical weapon. In 2010, it famously cut off rare earth exports to Japan during a territorial dispute. A reminder to the world that modern weapons, electronics, and green energy all depended on Chinese-controlled supply chains. Now, the U.S. is returning the favor. Not with minerals, but with energy. Washington has built a reinsurance umbrella to keep oil flowing for its allies while leaving China exposed. American officials have openly described the strategy: protect friendly buyers and isolate the ones who played both sides. With U.S.-China trade tensions already at a boiling point, energy vulnerability is the last card that Beijing wants on the table. If China pushes too hard for cheap Russian oil, Washington may treat that as strategic alignment and respond with even harsher sanctions. If it pulls back from Iran, it loses its cheapest source of crude. Either way, the room to maneuver is shrinking fast. And this leads us to the most dangerous realization of all. China didn't just build a workaround. It built a structural dependency. The shadow fleet, the teapot refineries, the relabeled cargoes, the falsified paperwork. All of it was supposed to insulate China from the risks of the global energy market. But instead, it did the opposite. It concentrated those risks into a single fragile system, one that only works when the world is stable, when enforcement is lax, and when nobody is paying close attention. All three of those conditions are now gone. Every path forward carries a cost. Lean harder on Russia? Well, that'll invite even more Western sanctions and tariffs. Invest in renewables? China is doing that. Renewables actually surpassed oil as its second largest energy source in 2025, but replacing oil in heavy industry and long-haul transportation takes decades, not months. Double down on Iran? Well, that risks direct confrontation with the United States and alienates the Gulf states that China desperately needs. China's leaders have spent years building a system that let them operate outside the global rules. They bet that enforcement would stay weak, that the world would stay stable, and that no one would ever force them to choose sides. All three bets just lost. The era of cheap, infinite oil is over for China, and the system that was supposed to protect its growth may now be the thing that puts it all at risk. So what do you think? Can China find its way out of this trap, or is the damage already done? Drop your take in the comments and subscribe to Fall of Nations so you don't miss what comes next.